The year was 1903, and in the remote valleys of rural Pennsylvania, where the morning mist clung to weathered barns and forgotten homesteads, there existed a community so isolated that secrets could fester in silence for generations. It was here, in the shadow of the Allegheny Mountains, that one of the most disturbing family mysteries in American history would unfold, a tale so unsettling that even today, more than a century later, the descendants of those who witnessed it refuse to speak its name aloud. The story begins with Ezra Whitmore, a man whose weathered hands had worked the same patch of rocky soil for 37 years. His farm, nestled in a hollow where the winter winds howled like banshees and the summer heat hung oppressive and still, was home to his wife Margaret and their only child, a daughter named Constance. The family lived a life of quiet routine, marked by the seasons and the endless cycle of planting and harvest, their existence as predictable as the turning of the earth itself. Margaret Whitmore had been the light of that isolated household, her gentle laughter echoing through rooms that would later know only whispers and shadows. She possessed the rare gift of finding joy in the smallest moments, the first spring flowers pushing through the snow, the sound of her daughter's voice reading aloud by lamplight, the simple pleasure of Sunday morning prayers. But in the harsh winter of 1904, consumption claimed her life with merciless efficiency, leaving behind a husband whose grief would soon transform into something far more sinister. Constance was 17 when her mother died, a young woman whose beauty was spoken of in hushed tones throughout the valley. Her auburn hair caught the light like autumn leaves, and her green eyes held a wisdom that seemed to belong to someone much older. The local pastor, Reverend Thomas Hartwell, would later write in his private journal that Constance possessed an ethereal quality, as if she existed partially in this world and partially in some other realm entirely. It was this otherworldly beauty that would ultimately become both her blessing and her curse. In the months following Margaret's death, neighbors noticed a change in the Whitmore household. Ezra, once a man who could be found sharing evening conversations on his front porch, became increasingly reclusive. The farm, once meticulously maintained, began to show signs of neglect. Weeds crept into the garden beds, and the barn roof developed leaks that went unrepaired. But most troubling of all were the glimpses that passing travelers caught of Constance herself. The young woman who had once walked to the village market with her head held high now moved like a ghost through her own home. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, the postmaster's wife, noted in a letter to her sister in Philadelphia that Constance appeared to have aged years in mere months, her face bearing an expression of profound sadness that seemed to emanate from her very soul. When questioned about her well-being, the girl would only offer the faintest of smiles and speak of caring for her grieving father. It was during this period that the first whispers began to circulate through the valley. Jacob Morse, the traveling merchant who brought supplies to the remote farms, reported strange sounds emanating from the Whitmore house during his evening visits, conversations that seemed too intimate for a father and daughter, laughter that held no joy, and on one particularly unsettling occasion, what he described as weeping that seemed to come from two voices simultaneously. The truth began to emerge in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting distorted images of a reality too horrible to comprehend fully. Sarah McKinnon, the school teacher who had known Constance since childhood, attempted to visit the farm in the spring of 1905, concerned about the girl's prolonged absence from church services. What she discovered there would haunt her for the remainder of her days. Upon arriving at the Whitmore farm, Sarah found Constance tending to the kitchen garden, her movements mechanical and her eyes distant. When asked about her father's whereabouts, Constance gestured toward the fields but would not meet the teacher's gaze. It was then that Sarah noticed the ring upon the young woman's finger, a simple band of gold that bore an unsettling familiarity. As their conversation continued, Sarah realized with growing horror that the ring adorning Constance's hand was the same one that had belonged to her mother, the wedding band that Margaret Whitmore had worn for 20 years. When confronted about this observation, Constance's composure cracked like ice beneath warm sun, and she confessed through broken sobs that she had become her father's wife in all but name. The revelation that Ezra Whitmore had taken his own daughter as his spouse sent shockwaves through the small community, though the full extent of their unholy union would not be understood for years to come. While exploring these dark corners of human nature, one cannot help but reflect on how isolation and grief can corrupt even the most fundamental bonds of family. If you find yourself drawn to these forbidden chapters of history, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below and join our community of truth seekers by subscribing to the channel. Sarah McKinnon, despite her shock and revulsion, remained loyal to the young woman she had once taught to read and write. Through careful questioning and patient observation, she began to piece together the gradual deterioration of the Whitmore household following Margaret's death. Constance, in moments of desperate clarity, revealed that her father's advances had begun with seemingly innocent requests for comfort in his grief. She would sit by his bedside during the long nights when sleep eluded him, reading aloud from her mother's favorite books, or simply holding his hand as he wept. But grief, like a poison in still water, had transformed Ezra's paternal love into something twisted and predatory. He began to speak to Constance as if she were Margaret reborn, calling her by her mother's pet names and expecting her to fulfill roles that no daughter should ever be asked to assume. The isolated nature of their existence meant that there were no witnesses to protest, no voices of reason to intervene, and no escape for a young woman who had been taught from birth to honor and obey her father above all else. The marriage ceremony, if it could be called such, took place in the parlor of the Whitmore house on a rain-soaked evening in October of 1905. There were no guests, no flowers, no joy, only a broken man claiming his daughter as his bride, and a young woman who had learned that survival sometimes requires the abandonment of one's very soul. Reverend Hartwell, when approached by Ezra to perform the ceremony, had refused in horror and threatened to alert the authorities. But in those days, in such remote places, the law was often as distant as the nearest town, and justice was a luxury that many could not afford. The diary that Constance kept during these dark years, discovered decades later hidden beneath the floorboards of the Whitmore house, provides a window into a hell that few could imagine and fewer still could endure. Her entries, written in a hand that grew increasingly shaky with each passing month, speak of nights filled with terror and days consumed by shame. She wrote of lying awake, listening to her father's breathing, praying for the strength to endure until dawn, and of mornings when she would study her reflection in the mirror, searching for traces of the innocent girl she had once been. One particularly haunting entry, dated November 15, 1905, reads, "The autumn leaves fall like tears from heaven, and I wonder if God himself weeps for what has become of his children in this cursed hollow. I am no longer Constance, daughter of Ezra and Margaret Whitmore. I am something else entirely, a creature born of grief and desperation, neither wife nor child, but some terrible hybrid that nature never intended to create." The physical manifestations of her psychological torment began to show within the first year of their unholy union. Constance, once robust and healthy, became gaunt and hollow-eyed, her auburn hair losing its lustrous shine and her green eyes taking on the glassy quality of someone who has seen too much of the world's darkness. Dr. Samuel Morrison, who served the scattered communities throughout the valley, was summoned to the Whitmore farm on several occasions during the winter of 1906, always at night and always under circumstances that struck him as peculiar. The physician's own notes, preserved in the archives of the County Medical Society, describe a patient who exhibited symptoms of profound melancholia coupled with what he termed nervous exhaustion of an unusual nature. When pressed about the source of her ailments, Constance would only speak of caring for an invalid husband, never acknowledging that the man in question was her own father. Dr. Morrison, though perhaps suspecting the truth, found himself constrained by both professional ethics and the social conventions of the time. The first child was born in the summer of 1907, a son who entered the world already marked by the sins of his conception. Little Thomas, as he was named, bore such a striking resemblance to his grandfather that even the midwife who assisted with the birth crossed herself and whispered prayers of protection. The infant's cries, according to those who heard them, held a quality that seemed to speak of suffering beyond his years, as if he understood even in his first moments the terrible circumstances of his existence. Constance's diary entries from this period reveal a woman caught between maternal love and existential horror. She wrote, "How can I love what should not be? How can I nurture what was born from such darkness? Yet when I hold him to my breast, I see not the product of sin, but an innocent soul who deserves better than the world into which he has been thrust." The community's response to these developments was one of willful blindness mixed with horrified fascination. The more religious among the valley's inhabitants spoke of divine judgment and generational curses, while others simply chose to pretend that the Whitmore family no longer existed. Children were forbidden from playing near the hollow where the farm stood, and travelers learned to take longer routes rather than pass by the house where such abominations had taken place. As the years passed and more children followed, 3 more sons and 2 daughters, each bearing the unmistakable stamp of their shared parentage, the weight of their secret grew unbearable. The physical isolation of the farm became a prison from which escape seemed impossible, and Constance found herself trapped not only by her circumstances, but by a growing sense of complicity in her own degradation. Her diary entries from 1910 reflect a woman wrestling with questions that had no answers. Am I victim or accomplice? Have I become willing participant in my own destruction? The line between coercion and consent has blurred until I can no longer distinguish between what I am forced to do and what I choose to do. Perhaps there is no difference anymore. Perhaps I am exactly what this hollow has made me, something that exists beyond the boundaries of decent society. The children, as they grew, began to exhibit behaviors that alarmed even their isolated community. The boys displayed an aggressive nature that seemed at odds with their years, while the daughters possessed an unsettling maturity that manifested in their understanding of adult matters far beyond what should have been appropriate. Visitors to the farm, rare though they were, reported conversations with the Whitmore children that left them deeply disturbed, speaking of family relationships and household dynamics that suggested knowledge no child should possess. If you're captivated by these dark revelations of hidden family secrets, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe for more explorations into the shadowy corners of history that most prefer to forget. The beginning of the end came with the harsh winter of 1915, when a traveling preacher named Jeremiah Stone arrived in the valley. Unlike the local clergy who had learned to avert their eyes from the Whitmore situation, Stone possessed both the moral conviction and the outside perspective necessary to confront such evil directly. His first encounter with the family came when young Thomas, now 8 years old, appeared at the makeshift church service Stone was conducting in the village schoolhouse. The boy's presence alone was enough to create an atmosphere of tension among the gathered congregation, but it was his innocent questions about marriage and family that revealed the full extent of the horror taking place in the isolated hollow. When Thomas referred to his mother as father's wife and spoke casually of siblings who shared both parents in common, the visiting preacher understood immediately what he was confronting. Stone's journal, preserved in the archives of the Methodist Episcopal Church, describes his decision to visit the Whitmore farm as a calling from the Almighty to confront Satan himself in his earthly dwelling. What he found there confirmed his worst suspicions and more. Ezra Whitmore, now in his 50s but appearing decades older, greeted the preacher with a mixture of defiance and desperation. The years of living with his unspeakable secret had transformed him from a simple farmer into something far more sinister, a man who had convinced himself that his actions were not only justified, but ordained by forces beyond human understanding. Constance, when Stone finally met her, was a shadow of the vibrant young woman she had once been. At 28, she appeared closer to 50, her beauty consumed by years of psychological torment and the physical demands of bearing children under such horrific circumstances. Her eyes, once described as windows to a gentle soul, now held the hollow stare of someone who had been broken beyond repair. The confrontation between Stone and Ezra Whitmore lasted throughout a single night, but its effects would reverberate through the valley for generations. The preacher's attempts to convince the man of his sins were met with twisted justifications and biblical interpretations that perverted scripture to serve the darkest of purposes. Ezra spoke of Abraham and Isaac, of Lot and his daughters, weaving together fragments of religious text to create a tapestry of rationalization that made his actions seem not only acceptable, but divinely inspired. But it was Constance's testimony, delivered in whispers broken by sobs, that finally shattered the wall of silence that had protected this unholy union for over a decade. She spoke of nights filled with terror, of children who would never know normal family relationships, of a love that had been twisted into something that defiled everything sacred about the bonds between parent and child. Stone's decision to involve outside authorities marked the beginning of a legal and social reckoning that would consume the entire community. The arrival of state law enforcement officials in the spring of 1916 brought with it a scrutiny that the valley's residents had never experienced. Questions were asked that had been avoided for years, and answers were demanded from people who had grown comfortable with their collective silence. The children were removed from the Whitmore home and placed in the care of various relatives and charitable organizations throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. The separation was traumatic for all involved, as these young people had never known a world beyond their father's farm and struggled to understand why their family was being torn apart. Social workers reported that the children displayed confusion about basic social norms and family structures, often asking questions that revealed the depth of their isolation and the abnormality of their upbringing. Thomas, the eldest, was sent to live with distant relatives in Ohio, where he would spend years trying to overcome the psychological damage of his early childhood. The other children were scattered across the region, their names changed and their histories concealed in an attempt to give them fresh starts. But the scars of their origins would follow many of them throughout their lives, manifesting in difficulties with relationships, struggles with identity, and an ongoing battle against the shame of their birth. Ezra Whitmore faced charges of incest, child abuse, and various other crimes related to his treatment of Constance and their children. The trial, when it finally took place in the fall of 1916, became a sensation that drew reporters and curious onlookers from across the state. The testimony presented painted a picture of psychological manipulation and gradual corruption that shocked even experienced legal professionals. Constance's appearance on the witness stand was described by newspaper accounts as one of the most heartbreaking spectacles ever witnessed in a Pennsylvania courtroom. Her voice, barely above a whisper, recounted the years of abuse and manipulation with a detachment that spoke to the depth of her psychological wounds. She described how her father had gradually transformed her from grieving daughter to reluctant wife, using her love and loyalty against her until resistance became impossible. The defense team's attempts to portray Ezra as a man driven to desperation by grief and isolation fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence of calculated manipulation and abuse. The jury's deliberation lasted less than 2 hours, and their verdict of guilty on all charges was met with spontaneous applause from the packed courtroom. Ezra Whitmore was sentenced to life in prison, though he would serve only 3 years before dying of pneumonia in his cell at Eastern State Penitentiary. His death was reported in local newspapers with relief rather than mourning, as if the entire region could finally exhale after holding its breath for over a decade. But for Constance, the end of her father's legal punishment marked only the beginning of her own lifelong struggle with the consequences of their union. Released from the prison of her father's house, she found herself trapped in a different kind of hell, that of social ostracism and personal shame. The woman who had once been the victim of unspeakable crimes was now viewed by many as a willing participant in acts that decent society could not forgive or forget. She spent her remaining years living under assumed names in various cities throughout the eastern United States, working as a seamstress and house cleaner while struggling to build some semblance of a normal life. Her attempts at relationships with men inevitably failed when her past was discovered, and she eventually resigned herself to a life of solitude and anonymity. The diary entries from her later years, discovered after her death in 1943, reveal a woman who never stopped wrestling with questions of guilt and responsibility. She wrote, "I have spent 27 years trying to understand whether I was saint or sinner, victim or accomplice. Perhaps the truth is that I was both or neither, or something else entirely for which our language has no proper words." The house where these horrors took place stood empty for several years after the family's removal, becoming a source of local legend and superstition. Children dared each other to approach its broken windows and sagging porch, while adults crossed themselves and quickened their pace when business forced them to pass by. Eventually, the structure was destroyed by fire under mysterious circumstances, though whether by accident or design was never determined. The hollow where the Whitmore farm once stood remains largely uninhabited to this day, as if the very earth itself has been tainted by what transpired there. Local real estate records show numerous attempts to develop the land, but each effort has been abandoned due to what developers cite as geological instabilities and unforeseen complications. The children born of Ezra and Constance's union faced varying degrees of success in overcoming their origins. Some managed to build normal lives, marry, and raise families of their own, while others struggled with mental illness and social adjustment throughout their lives. None of them ever publicly acknowledged their connection to the Whitmore scandal, taking their secrets to graves scattered across the country. Thomas, the eldest son, eventually became a Methodist minister in a small town in Kansas, dedicating his life to helping others overcome trauma and abuse. His sermons, according to those who knew him, possessed an understanding of human suffering that could only come from personal experience with the darkest aspects of human nature. He never married and never spoke publicly about his childhood, but his private papers, donated to a theological seminary after his death, contain references to original sins and inherited shame that suggest he never fully escaped the shadow of his origins. The daughters faced different but equally challenging obstacles. Sarah, the eldest girl, struggled with severe depression throughout her adult life, while Mary, the youngest, developed what would today be recognized as dissociative identity disorder. Both women spent considerable time in mental health institutions during an era when such treatment was primitive and often counterproductive. The ripple effects of the Whitmore scandal extended far beyond the immediate family. Several marriages in the valley were strained or ended when neighbors began to question what they had known and when they had known it. The local pastor, Reverend Hartwell, resigned his position and left the area, unable to reconcile his failure to act with his understanding of Christian duty. Dr. Morrison faced professional scrutiny for his failure to report suspected abuse, though he was eventually cleared of any legal wrongdoing. Perhaps most tragically, the silence that had enabled the Whitmore situation to continue for so many years was not broken by the scandal. Instead, it transformed into a different kind of silence, one born not of complicity, but of shame. The community's collective response was to pretend that the events had never occurred, to erase from memory and conversation any reference to the family that had brought such darkness to their peaceful valley. This institutional amnesia meant that the lessons that might have been learned from the Whitmore tragedy were never internalized. No discussions took place about the warning signs that had been ignored, no systems were established to prevent similar situations, and no acknowledgement was made of the community's collective failure to protect one of its most vulnerable members. The mystery that continues to haunt researchers and local historians is not what happened. The facts of the case are well documented in court records and contemporary accounts, but how it was allowed to happen. How does a community of ostensibly decent, God-fearing people stand by while such horrors unfold in their midst? What combination of isolation, social convention, and willful blindness creates conditions where evil can flourish unchallenged for over a decade? Modern psychologists who have studied the case point to several factors that contributed to the community's failure to act. The extreme isolation of rural communities in the early 20th century meant that family problems were considered private matters, not subjects for public intervention. The patriarchal structure of society gave fathers almost absolute authority over their households, making challenges to paternal decisions both socially unacceptable and legally difficult. Additionally, the stigma attached to sexual abuse often fell more heavily on victims than perpetrators, creating powerful incentives for silence. Constance's shame would have been seen as reflecting not just on herself, but on any family that attempted to help her, making intervention both emotionally and socially costly. The economic realities of rural life also played a role. In a community where survival depended on cooperation and mutual aid, alienating a neighbor, even one suspected of wrongdoing, could have serious consequences. The harvest season required collective effort, barn raisings demanded community participation, and winter survival often depended on the goodwill of one's neighbors. In such an environment, speaking out against family abuse was not just a moral choice, but an economic risk. The Whitmore case also highlights the limitations of religious and legal institutions in addressing complex family dynamics. The church, which might have provided moral guidance and practical assistance, was constrained by theological concepts of family authority and forgiveness that made intervention difficult. The legal system, distant and unfamiliar to most rural residents, seemed inadequate to address problems that were both deeply personal and profoundly criminal. As we reach the end of this disturbing journey into one of history's most troubling family secrets, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that the conditions that enabled such horrors have not entirely disappeared. Isolation, whether geographical or social, continues to provide cover for abuse. Family authority, though less absolute than in Ezra Whitmore's time, still complicates intervention in domestic situations. The shame that silences victims remains a powerful force in many communities. The story of Constance Whitmore serves as a reminder that evil often wears familiar faces and that the greatest monsters are not strangers lurking in shadows, but family members who exploit trust and love for their own twisted purposes. Her diary, with its heartbreaking chronicle of gradual degradation and lost innocence, stands as testimony to the resilience of the human spirit, even under the most horrific circumstances. The children born into this nightmare remind us that innocence can emerge even from the darkest origins, that the sins of parents need not define the destinies of their offspring, and that healing, though never complete, is possible even for those whose lives begin in horror. The community that failed to protect Constance teaches us about the dangers of collective silence and the responsibility that each of us bears for the welfare of our most vulnerable neighbors. Their failure stands as a warning across the decades, urging us to speak when we witness suffering and to act when we encounter evil, regardless of the social or personal costs. In the end, the horrible story of the father who married his own daughter is not just a tale of one family's descent into darkness, but a mirror reflecting the capacity for both evil and indifference that exists within all human communities. It challenges us to examine our own responses to suspected abuse, our willingness to intervene in difficult situations, and our commitment to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The shadows that fell across that remote Pennsylvania hollow in 1903 have never entirely lifted. They serve as a permanent reminder that the price of silence in the face of evil is measured not just in the suffering of immediate victims, but in the corruption of entire communities and the perpetuation of cycles of abuse that can span generations. The secrets we keep, whether out of fear, shame, or simple convenience, have consequences that extend far beyond our ability to predict or control. The Whitmore family's tragedy teaches us that some silences are not golden but toxic, and that the courage to speak truth in the face of horror may be the most important gift we can offer to those who have no voice of their own. History's darkest chapters often remain hidden in shadows, waiting for brave souls to bring them into the light. If this investigation into the forbidden secrets of the past has moved you, consider subscribing to our channel and joining our community of truth seekers. Leave a comment sharing which historical mystery you'd like us to explore next, and remember that your engagement helps keep these important stories alive. Together, we can ensure that the voices of the forgotten are never silenced forever.